form of nutrients. And when Robert said that organic fertilizer is getting to be the same price as inorganic fertilizer, that's true per pound. However, inorganic fertilizer has a lot more higher percentage nutrients in most cases. So no matter how you do the equation, organic fertilizer is a lot more expensive. And I'm not against it or anything like that. If you listen to Robert, you could say this is a pretty complicated thing, isn't it? This, that, you know, all kinds of different sources and things like that. And the beauty of inorganic fertilizer is it's real easy. You know, there's about 3 or 4 different formulations, and it's real easy to use. So
define inorganic one more time.
This is how I look at it. Okay.
Right.
Inorganic fertilizers is refined and purified sources of nitrogen, potash, or phosphorus.
Yeah, what comes from petrochemicals.
Well, okay. Okay.
It's oil-based.
That's right.
Okay.
Not all of it. There's muriate of potash, there's sulfate of potash, there's other kinds of fertilizer.
Sure.
If you're using urea, as an example, that would be a petrochemical.
Sure.
If you're using phosphorus sources, they're not petrochemical.
Sure.
So, don't get me wrong. Please, I'm not against organic fertilizing whatsoever. My theory in farming is keep it simple. Keep it real simple. Because otherwise, it gets too complicated and most people aren't capable of doing that. But before I go into any of the discussion of fertilizers, really what we really need to do here is to recognize the growth pattern of coffee. You know, like, when do you fertilize? How often do you fertilize? You know, some people say, I fertilize every month. I fertilize 4 times a year, 6 times a year. Well, if you really look at coffee and how it grows, you'll realize that from November, for sure November, I even want to say October, but November, December, January, and February, and March is what? Our dry season. What's happening in our dry season? Nothing. The trees are just sitting there. Some of them actually are doing worse than sitting there. But they're in a state of dormancy. So fertilizing during that time of year is only a marginal benefit. If you get lucky, you get a rain, you get a little tiny growth, but really the coffee does not start growing until May. And it grows May, June, July, August, and September. And it grows really, really fast during those months. If you don't believe me, study your trees. I've done it for a few years. Trust me. So, when do you want to fertilize? Well, you want to fertilize right at the beginning of the growth season. Makes sense, right? As soon as the trees are ready to grow, they got moisture, you fertilize them, they're on their way. That's what I do. I actually will study the weather. I will never ever fertilize if I know that we're in an extreme drought situation, because it's just like throwing money away. Especially today, because fertilizer is really expensive today. So, on my farm, I used to fertilize 3 times a year, but now I've cut it back to 2. Not because of cost, but because I began to realize that if you fertilize a good dose in May, or even in April, I do it in May, but usually if the rains start early, I'll start my fertilizer a little earlier. But April, May is when I first start my first application. And then I do another one about the end of July, or into August. And not just a little per tree. I'm talking, you know, like 6, 7 bags per acre when I do it. And I don't know how much that is per tree, because it varies. But a good dose around the trees. And then if you really want to, you can put another application sometime like in October to get, you know, the last one. I usually forego that because by that time we're into the harvest season and I'm not really wanting to encourage too much growth. One of the things that I should say here is that the amount of fertilizer you put on your farm is entirely up to you, and some people use soil analysis, some people use tissue analysis. If you go by the university recommendations, it's something like 2,000 pounds per acre per year, which is like an amazing amount. And I'll tell you what happens you get really, really nice, beautifully green trees. But the coffee that you get from those trees is not, it's flat. I like to say it's flat. It lacks, it's flat. And that's because of excessive nitrogen. So you want to be really careful. In fact, one of the differences between organic fertilizer and inorganic fertilizer is organic farmers have a really hard time with getting their nitrogen levels up. Inorganic farmers have too easy a time of excessive nitrogen application. So excessive nitrogen is actually worse than too little. And how do you know that? Well, let's just, you go back and you look at the cupping contest over the last whatever, how many years you want to go, and you'll notice one thing. Organic farmers almost always are the bulk of the top 5. They don't always win, but they almost always win. Correct?
Correct.
Yay!
Yes. And one of the reasons, one of the huge reasons is most organic farms are nitrogen deficient. You don't get high yields, except for Robert. You don't get high yields, but you get really good, tasty coffee. So that's the trade-off. And I would like to say, if you really are, somewhere in the middle is where you want to be. You want high yields, but you also want to have a good cup. Because ultimately, that's the most important thing for those of us that sell our coffee individually to people, all over the place. So, I think I've covered when to fertilize. And I'm not going to talk about how much to fertilize very much at all, because that's really entirely up to each individual farmer. It's up to the, your location. So many things come into play here that it's really hard to make one general statement. Every farm is a little different. But one of the things that you can always do is look at your coffee. Ask it, how are you doing? Are you happy? Maybe not like that, but or maybe. But you can look at a tree. That's what you need. That's what we need to do. Farmers need to be able to look at a coffee tree and have that tree tell you what's up. And they will. They really will. If you look at your trees carefully, if you really observe it. And that's really the most important thing here, is that none of this is done by the book. You have to be like the boot on the ground, so to speak. And that's how I tend to farm, is that I'm intimately involved with my trees every day. And I like to preach that a lot too. One last thing I wanted to talk about, well, not one last thing, but one thing I want to make mention right here, right now, is, we've talked about mulch, organic matter. And I don't know how many of you were lucky enough to listen to that soils guy that came to talk to us. What's his name? Jonathan Dienick.
He's the man.
He's the man. And you know what? He talked for like 3 hours. And he talked about everything. But there's one thing he said over and over and over again, is that Hawaiian soils really require a lot of organic matter. In fact, I think our soils are made up of something like 50–60% or more organic matter. It's amazing how much there is. And when you think of it, our soils are really young. We don't have the high clay and all that that's been able to be developed over thousands and thousands of years. So organic matter. So using every single available source of organic matter is really good for your farm. And even if you can't do your whole farm, you can do sections of it one year and another section the next year. I agree, bringing in the green waste or whatever that comes from the county is dicey. And I really have a hard time with that, because just like you were saying, you don't know what that is, you don't know what's been put on it. And it's a really good way to introduce bad things on your farm. And so utilizing your prunings and things like that is probably the best that we're going to be able to do. But if you always think organic matter, over the long run,